Hello, I'm Professor Rad, and today we're going to continue our example of graphing numbers on number lines, but we're going to be graphing decimals instead of integers, which is what we graphed in the last video. So my setup is going to be very similar to what it was for integers. So I'm going to start out by drawing my line. And I want to look for the biggest positive number and the biggest negative number, and that kind of tells me how far left and how far right I have to go. So on this first one, my biggest positive is 3.75, so I have to make sure I go up to 3.75. And I don't actually have any negatives, so what's the smallest positive here? We've got 1, 2 point something, 0 point something, and 3 point something. So the smallest is 0.25. So it looks to me like if I go from 0 to 4, that should be enough space for the graph. 0 because that'll be just before 0.25, and 4 because that'll be just after the 3.75. Right? You could even think of this in terms of money, right? This would be $3.75. So if I wanted to buy something worth that much, I need to make sure I have at least $4. Well, or some quarters or other coins, I guess. But regardless, let me put my 0 here and my 4 here, and I'm going to split that in half to get 2, and then split each of those in half to get 3 and 1. Now you don't have to put it this way. You can set up your numbers like we did in the last one, but I know that 4 splits in half and each of those halves splits up nicely. So I can set up my number line that way. And since these are the ones that I'm going to have labeled, I'm going to make these a little bit bigger. Now, I'm actually glad that I was thinking about that money or thinking about things in terms of quarters, because all of these would be like amounts I could pay with dollar bills and quarters, say, right? 75 cents would be 3 quarters, 25 cents would be 1 quarter, and 2.5, remember there's like an invisible 0 here, so that would be like $2.50, so I could use 2 quarters there. So a quarter means that you take $1 and you split it up into 4 coins, right? So a quarter is linked to fourths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these dollars, you could think of this line as a dollar bill, and I'm going to cut it up into fourths. So that this first line would be 1 quarter, so 25 cents. This would be 2 quarters, 50 cents, 3 quarters, 75 cents, and then $1. So that's how I'm going to split each of these up. Okay, so that kind of gives me a sense of where these numbers might want to live. So let's go ahead and graph these, and I like to do the easy ones first. So the easiest one is 1, because it's exactly one of those numbers we have labeled right here. So I'm going to graph a 1 by putting a dot there. Next we have $2.50, so that's 2.5. When graphing a number like this, I'm going to go over to 2, and then I want to go halfway between the 2 and the 3. So halfway is like right here. Then this next one is 0.25. This would be like if I had a single quarter. So 25 cents would be this first line. Remember, this was 25 cents, 50. 75 cents, $1. So our 25 cents is going to go right here at this first one. And then $3.75 is going to be $3 bills, so at least here. And then I have to add on 3 quarters. So 1, 2, 3 quarters. Here we go. Okay, so if thinking of signed numbers in terms of money is helpful for you, then that might have been a helpful way to think about this. But if you're like 75 cents, quarters, I'm not following Professor Rad, that's okay. I'm going to show you another way that we can think about this. So I'm going to draw another number line right underneath. I'm going to think about these numbers in a slightly different way, and you can see if this helps you imagine where decimals go better. Our initial setup is the same. We want to go from 0 to 4 because that's a good range for these numbers. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to think of these as like when we added numbers by hand and we wanted things to have the same number of place values so we could line them up. So for example, in 3.75, there's 2 decimal places here. There's 2 and 25. When I added that 0, there became 2 decimal places there. So if I want to do that for 1, I could think of that as 1.00. I can think of 2 as 2.00, 3 as 3.00, and 4 as 4.00. And gosh, I could even do 0.00. So instead of 1, I'm going to think of that as 1.00. This way, all of my numbers are kind of the same looking. We've got 1.2 things, 2.2 things, 0.2 digits, and 3.2 digits. Okay, so they all have the same kind of appearance. What this enables me to do is to think of this more like whole numbers than thinking of it like fractions, which is essentially what we did here. Instead of thinking of this as 1.00, I'm going to ignore that decimal point for a minute and just think of it as 100. So what is half of 100? So half of 100 is 50, right? 50% would be like a half. So I can kind of put these little marks here and know that those are going to be like 50s. So when I go to graph these numbers on this number line, I'm going to graph 1.00 first, easiest one because it's one of these numbers we already have. Then I have 2.50. So I'm going to think of that as, ignore the decimal and just think of it as 250. So this would be like my 200, and the 50 is halfway in between. So I can plot it here. The next one I have is 0.25. So again, I'm going to ignore that decimal and just think of that as like 25. So when I look at the numbers that I have, this is kind of like 0, this is kind of like 100. Half of 100 is 50. So if I'm thinking of this like 25, 25 is going to be in between 0 and 50. And 25 is half of 50. So it's going to be halfway in between the 0 and the 50. So the 0.25 or the 25 goes there. And then lastly, I have 3.75. Again, I can think of that as like 375. So here's 300, 350, and 400. So 375 is in between 350 and 400. And again, it's perfectly in between. So my 375 is going to go here. So if you write all of your decimals so that they're written out with the same number of digits, when you're plotting them on a number line with decimals, you can kind of ignore the decimal point and think of them in terms of hundreds, think of them in terms of whole numbers, and that might make it a little bit easier. The other thing I wanted to point out is I drew this number line directly below the other one, so we could see where we plotted those points lines up perfectly on both of those number lines. So really, we graphed exactly the same points, we just thought about it in a different way. Which to me is one of the things that makes math really cool, is that you can think about things in different ways and still get the same result. So let's look at part D. Part D now has some negative numbers, okay? So let's write out our number line. And I'm noticing we've got a -1 and a -0 point something. So it looks like I need to make it out to -1. That's the biggest negative. And for the positives, I have 1.8 and 0 point something. So it looks like I want to make it out to at least 1.8. That's the biggest one. So I think what I'm going to do is maybe I'm going to count by like 0.5s. So maybe I'm going to say this is like a negative 1.5. So here's my negative 1. Negative 0.5. So here's my 0. Okay, I was kind of counting backwards a little bit. So let's count frontwards now. So if that's 0, then that's 0.51. Or you could think of it like a half, right? Then this would be 1.5, 2. Well, I guess I made my line much longer than I needed to. Could have given myself some more space. But that's okay. Sometimes it happens. So we'll just do this. It helps if you sing when you scribble things out, because then you've made music out of a mistake, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and graph these numbers. And we can think about it just like we did with these decimals up here, which I think is how I'm going to think about these. So I'm going to write the numbers underneath, and it looks like the longest decimal I have is 2 decimal places. So I'm going to think of negative 1 as negative 1.00. Negative 0.2 is going to be like negative 0.20, so we have 2 decimal places. 1.8, I'm going to think of that as 1.80, again 2 decimals. And 0.68 is just 0.68. So I can make those changes to how I'm thinking about these whole numbers as well. So negative 1.00, 0.00, 1.00, and 2.00. So now when I go to graph these numbers here, I pretend like there's no decimal point there at all. So to me, this is going to be minus 100, which is easy because this is like minus 100. Okay. None of the others look easy. So we'll just tackle them one at a time. I'm going to avoid this minus because I don't want to deal with minus right now. Let's do 1.80, or I'm sorry, 180 if we want to think of it that way. So here's our 100, here's our 200, and halfway in between is 150. So if I wanted to, I could kind of envision, if this is 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 200. So sometimes it can be helpful to draw little tick marks, counting by a nice unit. In this case, I'm counting by tens. So if this is 50, 60, 70, 80. So this is about where 180 or 180 would go. Let's see if we can do that with the 68. So 68, here's my 0, here's 50. So 68 is bigger than 50, but smaller than 100. So here's 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Okay, now I should point out also, I'm being a little bit brave here using pens because I'm usually not making music out of mistakes here with number lines. I usually can judge the space pretty well, only because I've been doing this for like eons at this point. But especially when I first learned pencil, because sometimes you get your spacing wrong here, and that's okay. That's part of the learning process. So we're going to graph 68. So here's our 0, here's our 50. This line here is 60, and this next one is 70. So 68 is going to be close to the 70 line, but just a little bit before it. Now, these are pretty close distances, so we're just doing our best, okay? When you're doing this by hand, what you really want to do is just make sure you're close to the right line, right? Okay, so we did this one, we did this one, and we did this one. So now we have to do this negative. Remember when you're graphing negatives, right? You start at 0 and you move to the left. So if this is 0, this would be like negative 50. So here's negative 50. This is negative 20. So I would need to pass 20 before I get to 50. So it's going to be in this interval here. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Okay. So we have negative 20. So 10, 20, right around here. So cool. We graphed that one too. Done. So in this instance, remember that 1 is not the same number as 100, but we can think of it similarly to how we would think of 100 in terms of our spacing. So I have a couple of number lines for you to go ahead and try. So see if you can graph these out on a number line. In our next video, we are going to be revisiting bar graphs. And this time, instead of just reading a bar graph, we're going to be creating a bar graph. So looking forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, have a wonderful day. Bye.